Okay, you're about to hear one of my heroes talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Captain Charlie Plumb. You want to stand out of here?
Let's roll that video. I'd like you to watch a little video which sort of sets the stage on my experience. I was a fighter pilot for the Navy and flew 74 successful combat missions in Vietnam. And here I am on the Kitty Hawk aircraft carrier. That's my F-4 Phantom there, 202. This is what happens on board aircraft carriers. We have a little shorter runway than the Air Force, Dick. That's fun. This is the part that's not so much fun. And that's me. Shortly after that picture was taken, I was tortured for 2 days for military information and political propaganda, and I was tossed into a little bitty cell. That cell was exactly 8 feet long and 8 feet wide. I remember distinctly the dimension of that little cell. I could pace 3 steps in one direction before I ran into a wall. Then I had the opportunity of turning around and pacing 3 steps the other way. Believe it or not, there's a lot to be learned in a little prison cell. The first thing you learn about is pain. And it hurts. It hurts a lot. And you establish plateaus of pain through the torture sessions. I found myself saying, if it doesn't get any worse than this, I'm going to survive. I'm going to make it. And then they tightened the ropes, and it got worse. And then I found that if it doesn't get any worse than this, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to make it. I'm going to survive. And then it got worse. And so I established these various plateaus of pain, and I learned to live with that. The second thing you learn in a prison cell is that, well, eventually the minutes wear into hours, and the hours wear into days, and days into weeks and months, and you acclimate. You learn how to breathe deeply and think about things far away, sunny beaches and warm breezes and thoughts of home, and you know what happens? You get used to this. You really do. In fact, you get so comfortable in your little prison cell, the last place you want to go is outside the cell because it's dark and lonely out here, and at least you know the devil in the light. What happens is you get a restriction built up, and it's not the 8 feet between the walls. It's the 8 inches between your ears. You're in a mental box, and this is a mental game. Ever been in one of those mental boxes? I think we all get there once in a while. You can't see the forest for the trees. You get this myopia. And that's what happened to me. That's what happened to all of us in that prison camp. And so to break free wasn't to actually escape from the physical prison, but it was to escape in your mind. And that's what we learned to do. I began by thinking, this is so terrible, I'm going to go crazy here. Nothing to do, no books to read, no window to look out, no TV, telephone, BlackBerry, Bluetooth. I didn't have a pencil. or a piece of paper for 2,103 days. I spent 6 Christmases in that prison camp, and I'll tell you a little bit more about those Christmases later. But what happens in a prison cell and the way that you learn these things is through the experience itself. And so I decided if I'm not going to go stir crazy, I'm going to have to come up with something to do, get a little creative here. I thought that's what I'll do. I'll make a little deck of cards. And I did. I constructed a little deck of playing cards about the size of postage stamps. I tore these cards from 52 little strips of toilet paper. And I can tell you this with authority. Toilet paper is tough to shuffle. Okay, before we get back into my experience in Vietnam, let me tell you about my experience with the CAF. As many of you know, I have a PT-19 here on display in this museum. And I would like right now to personally thank anybody who's turned wrenches or painted or anything else on that PT-19. Would you please stand up? Please, Tom, Rick, great, George, Gene. It has been such a delight for me to have that old airplane in here and have you guys and gals take such good care of it. And while the skipper, while Steve was up here congratulating all these other folks for the job that they do, and I totally agree with that, I think we need one big round of applause for Steve Barber. Where are you, Steve? Susan and I went back to Vietnam 3 years ago. First time I'd been back since I was released from the prison camp. They invited me back there to meet the camp commander, the guy who'd been in charge of all of our torture, the guy we call the Rat. He was getting old, and they said that he wanted to meet a prisoner of war, an American pilot. And so I agreed to go back with him, and I took Susan and 3 of our kids back with me. And it was a very interesting experience because I was to meet the guy who was in charge of the torture. And I thought in some small way that he might want to apologize. I mean, he's getting old, and maybe he wants to make amends. Maybe he wants to make it right. And nothing could be farther from the truth. I walked into his house. The first thing he did, he wanted to hug me. And then he brought out his homemade beer, and he wanted to share his homemade beer with me. And the first words out of his mouth was, "I served as your warden from 1968 to 1972. And my proudest achievement was that you were never hurt and you enjoyed your life while you were here in Vietnam." And I'm saying, wait, it's me, Bubba. You don't remember that? Well, we were there for 11 days. In fact, I sent Susan and the kids back home, and I was there for one more day and found myself in a park in downtown Hanoi. I saw in a distance a lady who was selling cards in the park. She was missing her right leg from about her waist on down, and she was on crutches. And she had a bag slung over her shoulder, and she was selling cards out of this bag. Want to buy a card? Want to buy a card? And I could tell that she was about my age, or maybe a little bit younger. And I said, "I'll buy a card, but I'd like to know your story." Well, she spoke perfect English. I was really surprised. Probably as good English as anybody I'd met. And we'd been all over North and South Vietnam. I spoke at the embassy there. I met cab drivers and professors and waitresses. And so by this time, I had a pretty good feel of what was going on in this country that I hadn't seen for 43 years. And so we sat down on a park bench. And I said, "How'd you lose your leg?" She said, "Linebacker 2. For those of you who are over in Vietnam, you remember Linebacker 2? Bill does. He was flying A4s A7s over there as well. Linebacker 2 was the B-52 bombings Christmas of 1972. And it pretty much drove them to the peace talks and the table. And we, the POWs, really hold those B-52 drivers in high esteem because we think that they pretty much ended that war. And that was Linebacker 2, but it was a secret Nobody was supposed to know linebacker 2. And this gal, instead of saying, I lost my leg in an air raid, she says, linebacker 2. Well, I'm trying to, check out and make sure that she's honest with me. I said, when was that? She said 24 December 1972. And I knew that she was right. She said I was 14. She described to me what had happened to her during that war. And as she spoke, I said, it's incredible to me that you speak such beautiful English. Why aren't you a translator? Why aren't you a guide in one of the museums here in Hanoi? She said, oh, my government would never give me a permit to do that. I'm an invalid, and my government does not want me representing the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And I'm thinking to myself, two people sitting on this park bench, both have scars from the same war. One of them has 2 airplanes and a boat and travels the world, and the other is selling postcards in a park to try to eke out a living. And the only difference, because she was certainly as smart as I was, the only difference I could see was the environment in which we live. That I live in a country that I have that opportunity. I can do anything I want to do. I can be whoever I want to be, and she could not. She was so restricted. Which brings me to my point about the CAF. It's more than airplanes, guys and gals. It's more than flying and having fun, guys and gals. It's continuing the heritage of this great nation of ours and the freedoms that we have. There's no country in the world that has the freedom to fly as we do here, and the freedom to achieve anything we want to achieve. And it's wonderful to do that. And so I'd like to call each of you a parachute packer. Let me explain that. I sat down in a restaurant in Kansas City where I used to live. About 2 tables over, a guy kept looking at me. I didn't recognize this gent. This is several years after I came back from Vietnam. This fellow finally stood up, and he walked over to my table, and he pointed at me, and he said, "You're Captain Plumb." I looked up, and I said, "Yes, sir, I'm Captain Plumb." "You're that guy? You flew jet fighters in Vietnam. You're a fighter pilot. Part of that Top Gun outfit in Miramar. You were flying F-4s off the Kitty Hawk. You were shot down. You parachuted into enemy hands. You spent 6 years as a prisoner of war." Somewhat dumbfounded, I looked up at this guy and I said, "How in the world did you know all that?" He finally broke into a smile and he said, "Because I packed your parachute." Tell you this, with this guy that runs around the country making speeches, suddenly I was speechless. The best I could do was stagger to my feet, reach out a very grateful hand of thanks. He came up with just the proper words. The guy grabbed my hand, he pumped my arm, and he said, "I guess it worked." Said, "Indeed it did, my friend, and I must tell you I've said a lot of prayers of thanks for your nimble fingers, but I had no idea I'd ever had the opportunity of expressing my gratitude in person." He said, "Were all the panels there?" I said, "No, I must be honest with you, they weren't. Of the 18 panels I was supposed to have in that parachute, had only 15 good ones. 3 of the panels were torn. But it wasn't your fault, it was mine. I ejected from that F-4 Phantom at 600 knots, close to the ground. I was well outside the envelope of that parachute. You did your job, I didn't do mine." I said, "But let me ask you a question. Do you keep track of all the parachutes you pack? Do you know of all the lives you've saved?" I said, "No." And this is the most important part of the conversation that night. Maybe the most important thing I say to you this evening. I think it deals directly with the fellowship we have here at the CAF. Here's what he said. He said, "No, sir, I don't keep track of all the parachutes I pack. It's enough gratification for me just to know that I've served." Here's a sailor, a rigger, well below the waterline of this aircraft carrier. His job is to stand at a long wooden table and weave the shrouds and fold the silk panels of these parachutes and pass them along one after another, while the jet jockey, while the Top Gun zooms around the sky at the speed of sound, couldn't have cared less about that guy down there in the hole. until one day my parachute came along. And he dutifully packed mine up for me. Question becomes, who packs your parachute? Maybe more importantly, who looks to you for that kind of strength in that kind of need? Because you see, I think that's what holds us all together, and particularly in organizations like this, and specifically, what does it take to keep the heritage alive? Well, it takes all of you volunteers. It takes guys like Clay and Cy here that are willing to share their wealth with us to build big hangars and big museums. And that's connection. It's that parachute packing is what I'm talking about. But we had a lot of parachute packers in that prison camp. It was pretty amazing the way people stepped up to the plate and took leadership roles. And in fact, a study was done just 3 years ago about all of the combatants of Vietnam. 30.6% of anyone exposed to the Vietnam War now has post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Of the prisoners of war, 4% of us have PTSD. And not only that, but it's primarily the guys who were shot down near the end of the war were only prisoners for a few weeks or a month or two. They've got more problems than the ones of us that were there 6, 7, 8.5 years, as my buddy Ev Alvarez. What's the difference? Well, the psychologists and psychiatrists that know a whole lot more about this than I do said it was because of the leadership that we had in that prison camp and the unity that we built in that team of prisoners of war. Imagine yourself being the senior person in a prison camp. You can't see your people. You can't hire them. You can't fire them. You cannot restrict their liberty. You can't give them bonuses. What kind of leadership techniques would you apply in a situation like this? And yet guys like Jim Stockdale and Jeremiah Denton and John McCain, and John was my flight instructor. He was shot down 5 months after I was in 1967. I knew John pretty well. He taught me to fly jets in Meridian, Mississippi. I also knew his brother. We know his brother better than John, as a matter of fact, Joe McCain. I knew that his dad, John and Joe's dad, was an admiral. In fact, he was Cinque Pac. And their grandfather, John and Joe's grandfather, was an admiral in World War II. So when I was peeking through my crack in the door and I see this new prisoner come into the gate, the guy was on a stretcher. I couldn't see his face. All I could see was an arm hanging over the edge of this stretcher, and it was green and gray. I didn't know if the guy was alive or dead. They stuffed him in cell 3. I was in cell 1 in that prison camp, and so I got a hold of the guys next door, and I said, you better make contact with this new guy because he's hurting and he may not make it. They tried for weeks to contact this new guy. Then I'm peeking through my crack in the door, and outside of cell number 3 was a big pile of white hair, like fluorescent white hair. Now, most of us were in our 20s or early 30s, and very few fighter pilots had gray hair. And so I'm looking at this hair, and I'm thinking to myself, man, I hope I'm wrong, but it sure looks like, well, there's only one guy in the Navy I know of that's got hair like that. And if it's true, my old flight instructor's been shot down, John McCain. Didn't know for sure, and so the next time I got outside my cell with my bucket headed towards the sewer house, as I passed that cell number 3, I let the guard get a little ahead of me, and I whistled. I dumped my bucket, came back past cell 3 very faintly from inside that cell. I heard, it was John McCain. Was he torn up? 7 broken bones when he was shot down. And they were twisting his broken bones to torture the poor guy. But a tougher guy I don't think we had in that prison camp than John McCain. He was always in their face. Anytime there was an interruption in the camp agenda, you knew McCain was behind it. Things haven't changed much. He lived right across from this sewer house. The sewer house was this little brick building with a hole in the middle, and that was the sewer. And so we had 2-gallon buckets. That was our toilet. And every 3 or 4 days, they'd let you out of your cell, and you'd carry it down, and you'd turn the corner, and you'd go into the sewer house. Well, the bad news was it stunk like high heaven in there, man. It was terrible. It was the worst smell you could even imagine, with rats and bugs and all this stuff. And you had to just hold your breath while you were in the sewer house. But the good news was the guards didn't like it any more than we did. And so they would not follow us into the sewer house. The only time 24/7 that they weren't watching you was when you were in there dumping your bucket. We decided it's a natural. We'll make a communication system out of the sewer house. And so we designated various cracks in bricks, okay, to be like a P.O. box. And so each cell had its own little crack between bricks. And so you write a note on a piece of toilet paper in ink made from brick dust or ashes, and you'd put it in your belt loop, and you'd carry your bucket into the sewer house, and you'd pick up your mail in your P.O. box, and you'd put your letters you're delivering to somebody else. It was a thing of beauty. Until one day, my buddy comes down the track, and right in front of McCain's cell, he turns his corner into the sewer house, and his note falls out of his belt loop. Oh, this is serious stuff. If they find that note, they're going to not only beat this guy up pretty good, but it's going to destroy our entire communication system. The fellow didn't know what to do. McCain is standing there on his homemade crutches, looking out a crack in his cell door. He starts pounding on the door. He starts yelling at the top of his lungs, cussing, and every word he can imagine. The guard was distracted, came over and beat up John McCain while my buddy picked up the note and went on into the sewer house and went on his way. And I don't know your political leanings, but I will tell you this, that McCain is one tough dude. He's got some problems right now, and if you're in the mood, tonight before you go to sleep, pray for John McCain. He needs your prayers. But not the best. You know, the best parachute packer in a prison camp turned out to be the lowest ranking guy there. A Navy sailor, an enlisted man. We were all officers. We were pilots. We were college graduates. We were lifers. Who shows up? A Navy sailor? How did a sailor get into a prison camp in an air war over North Vietnam? Well, he fell off his ship. He used to tell us, I wasn't captured like you pilots. I was rescued. And indeed he was. 19 years old, Seaman Douglas Hegdal from Clark, South Dakota. He's in a fantail of the cruiser Canberra in the middle of the night. Ship burps. He falls off. But could he take a joke? We'd have these contests. You know, our secret code, we would tap on walls or tug on wires, and we'd pass around a little questionnaire. Who's the oldest in the prison camp? Who's got the most kids back home? Who's been here the longest? One time we had what we called the high-fast, low-slow contest to try to determine what fighter pilot had jumped out of his jet going highest and fastest, who jumped out going lowest and slowest. Well, high-fast contest was won by some Air Force jock who claimed he punched out of his F-105 at 52,000 feet, 1,000 miles an hour. And the low-slow contest was won by the Navy sailor. 12 feet at 15 knots, right there. Oh, but here's the interesting part, and why I take your valuable time to tell you his story. This lowly, insignificant, minimum wage, new hire, low-ranking person, you know, the kind you have to rub elbows with, but usually they're more trouble than they're worth. The sailor didn't seem to suffer from this 8-inch box like the more mature of us fighter pilots did. I don't know why. I can't tell you. Sometimes I think he just wasn't mature enough to understand the problem. But he didn't blame anybody else for his problems. He didn't feel sorry for himself. He didn't deny that he had any control of his destiny. What did the sailor do? He set to work. He got into action. He made something happen. He kicked down what was left of his comfort zone, got further outside himself. He started tugging on wires and tapping on walls in our secret code and communicating with everybody in that prison. First thing he did was memorized our names, 254 names he put into his brain. He put them into songs. He would sing these songs over and over and over until he finally got them all. Wasn't nearly finished. Went back through his list. He memorized our Social Security number or identifier, 200 different long numbers. Unbelievable. Still not finished. Went back through his list. He memorized our hometowns all across the United States. Then he memorized our next of kin. And finally, I'm not kidding you, he memorized the telephone numbers of each of the relatives of each of the prisoners. That took 2 years. An interesting thing was happening about that period of time. Our wives were back here petitioning the government to tell the world that their husbands were being tortured. And so they started selling bracelets. How many remember these little silver bracelets? How many wore these things? Thank you for that. These bracelets, with this one has my name on it. It says Lieutenant Junior Grade J. Charles Plumb, 1967. There were over 1.5 million of these bracelets with all of our names, all the POW names on them. Our wives started to sell these things, and it funded their trips to foreign countries into embassies and the consulates to tell the world that we were being tortured. And it put pressure on the North Vietnamese, and the torture stopped. It was unbelievable. It's a story that hasn't been, I'm working with some of the folks in Hollywood to tell this story because it's a wonderful story of how the wives back here supported us over there and actually got our treatment improved. So the treatment improved about that time. It was about 3 years into it. And they decided that to make sure that the world knew that they were being lenient and humane, they were going to send some guys home early before the end of the war. The first guy they went to was John McCain. At the time, his father was CINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific. John's dad was in charge of the Vietnam War while John and I were prisoners. So they went to John. They said, "McCain, we're sending you home early before the end of the war." McCain said, "In your dreams you're sending me home early. I would never embarrass my father by doing that. I'd never give up on my pals, the other prisoners of war. You take your idea and shove it." And he got into a lot of trouble. Beat him up pretty good and put him in solitary confinement for another 2 years because he refused to go home. So they're still looking for someone. Somebody else is going to get hurt. So our senior man, Dick Stratton, sent the message to the sailor, to Doug Hegdal, and said, "Son, I want you to volunteer to go home first." Hegdal sends back, "Sir, with all due respect, I would rather stay here with the team. I want to march home with you guys. I want to be a part of the solution." Our senior man sent back, "That's not an option. Here's a direct order. Shove off." The sailor said, "Aye, aye, sir." Home he came. Now write the script on this sailor. What can you expect of this guy now? 2 years in prison by accident. He's been starved, humiliated, lonely, tortured, but things are looking up. He suddenly has a brand new suit of clothes on, 2 years back pay in his pocket, and he's free on the streets of San Diego. What can you expect of this guy? Oh, but he was another one of those parachute packers. One of those guys who really believed in service above self. What do you suppose he did? Sure, he started to travel, get west coast to east. He went north to south. He went through each one of the hometowns he'd memorized. He dialed each one of those telephone numbers he'd memorized. He spoke to each one of the wives he'd memorized, told her that her prisoner was alive. Let me ask you this question. You know those folks I'm talking about, those parachute packers? Well, look to your right and look to your left. This room is full of them. I've never seen an organization where we had so many dedicated volunteers that come out here day after day and week after week and year after year to keep the heritage alive, to keep our freedoms alive, to demonstrate what we have as an Americans. And don't give up on that. Don't ever give up on that. Well, there were several of you over there in Vietnam with me. And one of them I want to bring to the stage because this guy has more war stories than I do. What you know about Dick Rattan, of course, is he still holds a record of flying around the world nonstop, non-refueled. And how many of you were involved in that flight? Because I know many volunteers here, and folks donated toward that. What you don't know is that he was a crazy guy in Vietnam that flew suicidal missions. I think the Misties. Don't you think those are suicidal, Dick? And what I want to tell you about Dick is he's just written another book, and it's going to be published, in the next few months. Come on up here. Tell us some stories. Dick Rattan, folks. What's the name of your book, Dick?
The next 5 minutes. And the long title is, I wonder what the next 5 minutes of my life is going to be like.
And where did you come up with that title?
Well, I realized that there's a lot of incidents in my life where I was looking down a runway or pulling off a target in North Vietnam on fire. And the first thing that came to mind was, I wonder what the next 5 minutes of my life is going to be like. So anyway, that's the name of the book, and it's almost done.
And I look at a lot of aviation history and some, really, really important milestones. Wright brothers, of course. Doolittle's raid. I think Jimmy Doolittle is just had to be one of the bravest guys. There's only one surviving member of that 80 flight. Dick Cole is a friend of mine. He's 102 or something like that. Still going. But I really think that around the world flight is one of those things in aviation that's just, well, you had to be brain damaged to really do that, didn't you?
Now that's true, and it was a big challenge. And when my brother decided, or he thought that it was possible to fly unrefueled around the world, I realized that was going to be a major milestone. And you all know we took off and landed and made it. Anyway, the airplane hangs in the Air and Space Museum, and in 1987, the airplane was being enshrined in the National Air and Space Museum, which is quite an honor for a couple, three people up in Mojave with just a dream and not two nickels to rub together. But something very important for me happened there, and that was there was another individual in attendance, and his name was Lieutenant General now, Lee Wade. How many people in this audience know who Lee Wade was? He was in his 90s, and he died right after the meeting. Lee Wade was one of the pilots who flew around the world in 1924, when the Army America again, was first around the world. And as I sat there, and here are these two old guys standing beside his airplane, the Boston, in the National Air and Space Museum, and I had the honor of spending a little bit of time with Lee Wade, for crying out loud. And if you've ever want to hear an incredible story about aviation and challenge and so forth, you should read that. Anything you can about the first round-the-world flight. It's really something. But anyway, Charlie, I really appreciated, every time I see you and I get to talk to him, it reminds me of something. And standing right behind me is a red, white, and blue. And it's our precious flag. And what it represents. And there's a group of individuals back in the Vietnam War who purported themselves with extraordinary courage to make everybody proud. And Charlie mentioned one of them, and his name was Jeremiah Denton. And he was one of the first ones to get off the C-141 there at Clark that day, and he walked up to the microphone, and he said something so bloody profound that I can hardly say it without choking up. But it reminds me of who these people were and what they did to support our great country and that precious flag behind him. Now try to imagine, like Charlie and Jeremiah, how many years they spent in that horrible prison situation. Returned with honor. He gets off the airplane and he said something so profound to me, I thought it epitomizes who these people were. And he looked around and he said, I consider it an honor to have had the privilege of serving my country under difficult circumstances. Holy bananas. Where do we get such people? My boss got shot down and captured, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor as his conduct as a prisoner of war, for crying out loud. And Charlie, what you did and what your colleagues did to support our flag, and as long as there's some people like you all to stand up and go through such an incredible situation and still consider it an honor to have served that precious flag. God bless Charlie.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dick. You know, many of you here have taken the oath to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies. Many of you have not, and feel like in some small way you owe a debt to that flag and to the United States. And I'm convinced that your involvement here in the CAF as a mechanic, as a pilot, as a donor, is serving us, those who did serve over there, in a very gallant way. And so I hope you continue to be involved in this organization. I hope you continue to wave that flag. I hope you continue to go to the air shows and fix the airplanes and fly the airplanes and uphold the Constitution and our heritage just by your action within the Commemorative Air Force. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes because it's Christmas time and it's time for great delight. And I want to tell you, I spent 6 Christmases in the prison camp. But I want to tell you about the last 3 because this was the time when things were improving, all right? I found myself on my 4th Christmas there with an A4 pilot by the name of Danny Glenn. Dan Glenn was a architectural student at University of Oklahoma, and so he was sort of a slow-walking, slow-talking kind of a guy. And I was in a prison cell a little bit bigger than 8 by 8, but we had 4 guys in that cell, and so it was pretty tight. But it was early November, and I looked at Dan and I said, Dan, what are we going to do for Christmas this year? Dan said, oh, Charlie, you know what they do. They know when Christmas is, and every Christmas Eve they come in here and they raid the joint. You know, they tear up our cells, and they never let us have any kind of religious artifacts at all or to celebrate any of the holidays. So let's just forget it this year. Come on, Dan, you know what's happening back in Norman, Oklahoma? You know, they're putting their Christmas trees up and their lights, and so he said, what do you want, Charlie? I said, you see that blank stucco wall there in the side of this prison cell? I want you to create a nativity scene right there. Dan went to work. I couldn't believe it. He ground down pieces of brick. I didn't know brick came in so many colors, but he had orange and he had red and he had purple and he had blue and he had black and he had all this brick. He mixed it with a little bit of water and a little bit of rice paste, and he pulled out hairs and made a brush on the end of a stick of bamboo, and he started to paint. And I am convinced that mural would fit in any museum in the world because it was a thing of beauty. It was the nativity scene and the wise men and the shepherd and a baby Jesus in the manger and the star overhead. And we covered it up with a bunch of rags on our little clothesline there in the prison cell. Well, in they came. We had planned to do this on the night of the 23rd and be a day ahead of them. We just said it didn't make any difference which day we celebrated Christmas. But sure enough, they figured it out. And they came in, and Dan and I and our 2 roommates spent that night naked outside that cell while the guards obliterated this beautiful piece of art. The next year, I found myself in a much larger cell. It was 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, but we had 57 guys in that cell. There was a raid on one of our camps, and the enemy was furious, and so they put all of the outlying camps into the downtown one we call the Hanoi Hilton. And so we were all in this camp, and we were jammed in there, 57 guys in a 20 by 30 foot room. We each had 14 inches of bed space. And it was a thing of beauty because finally we were together. You know, we were unified, and we could talk, and we could, but they still would not let us celebrate Christmas. So early November, I look at Dan. I said, Dan, what are we going to do for Christmas? Oh, Charlie, you know, every year it's the same, and we got so cold out there last year. I said, No, we're going to do it a day earlier. This year we're doing it on the 22nd. That'll fool them, you know. We'll have it all done. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "You see the corner of this prison cell? And any of you who have been in the museum, the Hanoi Wallow Museum over there, have seen those prison cells. Those were the very cells that the Americans were in. In fact, the center cell there is that 8-foot by 8-foot cell that I was in. And I took Susan and our kids over there 3 years ago into that museum. Well, this big cell had high ceilings. I said, "You see the corner over there? I want a Christmas tree right there." Well, Dan set to work again with all of the paints and all of the bricks and all of the talent that he had, and he put together the most beautiful Christmas tree you've ever seen. And it had ornaments and popcorn strings and lights and star on the top and the very bottom in mosaic tile. It said, "Peace on earth." The entire thing 100% toilet paper. Well, sure enough, in they came the night of the 22nd. Oh, man. This time, Dan and I and 55 other guys spent that night naked outside that prison cell while the guards came in and they destroyed our Christmas tree. So the last Christmas I was there, Dan and I were in a 2-man cell in the mountains. It was a smaller cell than the 8x8. And about mid-November, I had rolled over. Now, you know, when you spend this much time in a prison cell with the same guy, you get to know each other pretty well. So I rolled over on my bed, and I looked at Dan and said, "Dan?" He said, "Nope." I said, "Come on, Dan, you know what they're doing in Norman, Oklahoma today? You know, maybe a few snowflakes there, and everybody's out Christmas shopping, and they're putting up the trees, and you probably have some kids coming around singing Christmas carols. You're going to let that go?" "What do you want?" I said, "Dan, you know, we're in the mountains, and we have no electricity here, and it's pretty dark." Dan says, "Yep, I've noticed that." I said, "I think we need a slideshow for Christmas." Well, we set to work. We took a tar paper tube, okay, and we rendered some lard from the sow belly that we were getting floating in our soup. We rendered this down and made a candle out of this lard. And we could light this candle and put it inside this tar paper tube. We cut a hole in the side of the tar paper tube so that the light would shine through the hole. And then we cut slides, silhouette slides. We did this with toilet paper, which, as you can imagine by now, was our only material that we had to work with. But if you take toilet paper and you put a little rice glue on it and let it dry, it gets real stiff. And then we'd cut out little silhouettes. And so we had probably a dozen slides. We had the wise men and the shepherds and the baby Jesus and all this stuff. And so, sure enough, here they come. Well, the good news was the Vietnamese couldn't understand what this was all about. They couldn't figure out what these slides were and how it really fit into this little projector that we had built for ourselves. And so they came in and they just wadded it all up and threw it over in the corner. So we got that back, and we very carefully flattened the slides back out and lit our little candle up there. And if you can imagine, 2 old, bearded, ragged guys sitting in a lonely little dark, cold prison cell in the middle of North Vietnam singing Christmas carols to each other while we were changing the slides from one to the other. And that was the last Christmas that I served in Vietnam. We've done really well, the POWs. Of the 591 men who've come home, we've produced 17 generals and 7 admirals, and most of us retired as senior grade military officers. We went back to flying airplanes and commanding ships and battalions and fleets all over the world. We have a bunch of congressmen, 2 United States senators, a vice presidential candidate, a presidential candidate, 2 ambassadors, a governor from our number, and as I mentioned to you, they're telling us today we're healthier mentally and physically than if we hadn't been shot down. What's the secret to all of that? Well, I am convinced that adversity is a horrible thing to waste. And if, in fact, we can embrace the challenges that we face in life, and pack parachutes for other people, if we can, in fact, give of ourselves, asking nothing in return, if we can, in fact, collect with organizations like this to reinforce and keep alive the heritage of the United States, then we can do anything we set our minds to do. Thank you. Merry Christmas to you all. Thank you.